Hi, I'm Nick Pollard, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about work. And I guess one of the things that it's important for this session to do is to maybe take a critical view of work when we're looking at work from a vocational rehabilitation or occupational therapy perspective. Very often we're considering it in a positive light, and in terms in particular of a balance between work, leisure and rest. But work is actually responsible for a lot of the illness conditions that we might see, and these are issues which are to do with the way that work is set up, the way that work is managed, the conditions of work, and the way that people maybe approach work within their everyday life. So one of the ways that we can begin to look at this is a book that was produced at the height of the age of consumption in the late 19th century, called The Right to Be Lazy, which was written by Paul Lafargue. Paul Lafargue trained as a doctor, and he was actually Marx's son-in-law, but he lived for quite a lot of time in northern France, and there he was able to observe the consequences of a fast developing textile trade, with people working very long hours in dangerous textile mills, women and children working 14-hour days with fast-moving machinery, lots of potential for accidents, and a great deal of potential for injury caused by fatigue and by poorly guarded machinery, by some of the jobs that particularly children had to do in freeing equipment that was perhaps still in motion when they were trying to disentangle reams of cloth that were going through them. So you could get scalped by the machinery if you had long hair and you hadn't got it tied back. You could easily get limbs broken or even pulled off. And a lot of people experienced injury through just falling into the machine because they were so tired. And his book was, you can read it on www.marxist.org. They put in Right to Be Lazy. You can find this book free online. And it's a passionate argument really for a shorter working day and much better conditions, but also arguing that one of the problems really at that time with the rise of consumption was the fact that people were producing all kinds of different cloths according to the demands of the fashion industry. It was being produced for the lowest possible labour cost to maximise profits, and people might be risking their lives to produce this stuff, and then find actually that the next month it was being dumped on the market at very low prices because nobody wanted to have spots or stripes or tartan or whatever it was in the patterns that month. So we were overproducing stuff that people didn't want, and in order to overproduce that stuff we were killing people. So you can look at that kind of equation in many different industries, the relationship between the productivity of a particular item, such as steel or oil or coal, and the price in terms of the number of injuries, the long-term illness, and the deaths that may result from those industrial processes. And as we've exported some of those industrial processes from the UK to other countries where labour is cheaper, also some of the safeguards and regulations are not necessarily as firmly in place as they might have been in the UK. And a consequence of that is that the rate of injury per tonne of steel produced may increase, for example. So, how do we get into this position of having work in our society? What changes took place? And one of the key sort of philosophical conception ideas behind occupational therapy in many of the health professions was the arts and crafts movement. So people like John Ruskin and William Morris, John Ruskin in particular, influenced William Morris, were interested in the transition which occurred at the end of the late medieval period, and this is about sort of 500-600 years ago. It's quite interesting to look at that period, because that was the point at which the beginnings of modern capitalism started to emerge. In other words, that people started to organise their work in different ways. It became possible for people to set up what became factories, or what looked like factories or workshops, in which items were produced on a larger scale. And this came about partly because at the end of the 14th century, so around sort of 1380, the time of the Peasants' Revolt, the Black Death had produced conditions where labour was in short supply. People who were labourers and artisans, if you like, that were craftspeople, tended to have better control of their own work. They could produce fine work when they were in control of how it was produced and how it was distributed. And that was also a point at which the nobility and the rising merchant classes contested the power of people to define their own labour. And that became possible because people were able to gain money to set up factories and workshops, and to increase the size of their farm holdings. And there was a rise in the production of wool, for example, so people needed more sheep, so the farms got bigger. So there are a number of changes to the way that people had a relationship to the land, to where they lived, and that became the cycle that eventually became the Industrial Revolution. And that was characterised by people being moved off the land, the enclosure of the commons, so that you couldn't graze your own livestock or grow your own vegetables in common land, but that was taken over by landowners and to organise their larger scale sheep farming or larger scale cultivation. And people moved into the towns and to the cities to find work as a consequence. Work was available because at the same time people were gradually building larger factories and workshops. The life expectancy actually probably reduced because the conditions of housing and sanitary conditions of living in cities were far worse. The tendency of this change meant that as people were less in control of their own work, wages were driven down, prices were driven up, and there's a history of contesting things like prices of bread, hours for work, the way that work was distributed, the way that women engaged with work over the following sort of 500 years. And it's linked directly to the process of colonisation and the development on an industrial scale of slavery in the period from the late 1500s, with first the Irish and then very soon black people from the Americas, but also actually Native Americans who were unsuccessfully tried as slaves initially, and convicted felons and religious dissenters and other social undesirables from various parts of Europe, particularly the UK. And all that created a kind of confederation of a motley crew, as Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker described it in their book, The Many-Headed Hydra, of people who were a continual source of opposition to the way that work practices have been set out. So the way that we see work practices now is very much a sort of top-down process. These are things that are defined by industry. They may be defined by professional groups, who are usually middle-class groups of people who've organised to protect particular professional values. Allied health professionals, we might be an example of that, but also trade unions, who at various times have also organised to try and protect the interests of certain groups of workers. The main reason for that kind of organisation is because work has been used as a tool of oppression. In economic theories such as the neoliberal free market thinking that has been popularised since the mid-1970s on the back of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, and every politician that came to power in the global north since, has been that you can use conditions of work and the threat of unemployment as a way of disciplining the workforce, and that goes hand in hand with the availability of credit, the expansion of gambling, and as further disciplinary measures. So people get themselves into debt to pay for the white goods they need, or the car, or the house, and as a consequence of having those overheads, they are less likely to kick against the structures put in place to contain their power, because after all they are economically dependent on their labour to be able to pay off those debts. So that was a deliberate theory, deliberate application of theory to try and reduce the bargaining power of various groups of workers in the 1970s. And it took sort of 30 years to arrive at the situation now. We have much weaker trade unions, much weaker legislation on health and safety at work, and one might argue that one of the consequences of the forthcoming crash out of Brexit might be to reset a whole number of structures that were developed in Europe, really as a result of its prevailing social democratic policy to try and govern the safer limitation of work with 48 hours maximum, and to keep people safe in work through a variety of conditions to protect them. So when we're trying to rehabilitate people back into work, we need to think about some of this broader context, how we may understand work and how we may understand the necessity of work as an imposition, because there are other ways of seeing work in the society that existed before the Industrial Revolution, and this was something that is remarked upon in the experiences of those people who were administrating the early colonies, for example, in North America. People who went over there exported as felons or religious dissenters, in many cases quickly found common interest with the Native Americans, who had a much freer way of life, weren't geared to overproducing stuff. They were trying to produce stuff that they needed in synergy with nature on the whole, and didn't need a whole load of possessions or property, and didn't need to own the land that they hunted in the same way that the white settlers needed to. This is quite similar to the situation which had existed when common people were thrown off the commons, if you like. And actually, an agricultural pace of life in any case didn't really require people to be working every hour that they could in order to produce stuff that could be sold in the marketplace. It was really about producing stuff that could be stored in event of famine and maybe a poor harvest, but also really to sustain the immediate wants of the community. So it's a very different way of existing, which has been brought into place with capitalism. That has tended instead to see the producers of labour as further commodities, parts of the machinery of production, and so they become units and to some extent dehumanised and depersonalised from the more community-centred relationships which may have existed beforehand. And more recently, there have been economists such as, or philosophers and economists such as Max Neef, who's talked about human scale development values, and talking about actually what people need. What people need is a place to be. They need social relationships. They need opportunities. They don't necessarily need money as such. And he asked the question, how did people get along with each other before there was money? And though we think about systems of barter, some of the other ways in which it's very evident that human societies got along is that they survived because they cooperated with each other and they worked together around communal needs. Ivan Illich, who was a philosopher from the late 70s, talked a lot about conviviality. He wrote a book called Tools for Conviviality, and another book called The Usefulness of Meaningful Unemployment, in which he described ways of people cooperating with communities in ways which maybe didn't necessarily have a straightforward economic value, but nonetheless had a value in binding the community together. And we might see these kinds of things in activities such as time banks, some of the alternative economy measures such as the Strouds, or in Sheffield I think there was a system called Stones, where people get together in a community, develop their own currency and use that as a unit of exchange for buying different, sometimes commodities, but very often work from other people in payment for some other work that they may be able to provide. Often these systems, because they're relying on some kind of economic exchange, don't work in quite the same way as time banks, where the unit of exchange is actually just an hour of your own time, and everybody's got time. So it's a much more egalitarian way of building community trust and rapport. So when you think about rehabilitating somebody into the workplace, it's worth thinking about why they're working, what they're working for, who they're working for, and what the values of work might be. Personally, I chose to be an occupational therapist because I wanted to work in a public organisation, i.e. the NHS, so that actually I was working for the people, not for somebody else's profit. And that was a definite decision after working in some companies where the motivation had been profit. And I thought that was, in my naive 20s, an ethical way of using my working time. That's much less possible now in the kind of reorganisation of our services and their capitalisation. But one of the things that I was very concerned about when I became an occupational therapist was actually this very issue of having a critical perception of what work and engagement might be, and how, as a public servant, occupational therapists were perhaps being employed to service the requirements not so much of the patient but of the status quo, which often produce the conditions such as work-related stress, work-related injury, which might have put the patient into a situation of needing occupational therapy support in the first place. If we are regularly working people excessive hours, if we set them up in jobs such as many of the transport jobs where we have flexible shift systems, people do a morning shift and an evening shift, and they never know, their body clock never knows when it's going to get a meal, for example. One week you're sleeping into the morning, next week you're working into the night, or you'll have to get up early in the morning and on the following shifts. It's very difficult for you to settle down, and the consequences of that actually do shorten your life. If you think about many of the industrial injuries that people acquire through heavy industry, which are still evident in this city today, then we still have newspaper adverts for white finger vibration, industrial deafness, actually did work on the buses. That's why I got an interest in that. One of the things that you noticed as a bus conductor was that in people buying tickets on the bus every morning, there were a hell of a lot of fingers missing from people's hands in a city that produced steel, knives, cutlery, industrial machinery, from industrial accidents. So there's an awful lot of work-related injury out there. And it may be that when we're moving people back into the workplace that we need to think much more carefully about those kinds of things. But we also need to think about the way that people are managed and the other things that happen in the workplace. So if you put people under a lot of pressure, they tend to bully each other more. They develop structures which are alternative to maybe professional codes of practice to get things done, or maybe to manage some of the stress that they're dealing with, and that also creates difficulties. There are social divisions within work. Pressures can be put on people because they do not work at the same rate or do not have the same ability to work at the same rate as other people, or because their skills gradually are unable to cope with the increasing amount of change. So just think about, for example, the pace at which computerization has affected work, the way that many of those processes have been transferred into the use of mobile telephones and other devices, where if you don't have the proficiency to use those skills, you soon run the risk of being excluded from the workplace. So the relationships around work encourage a disregard for people who may not have been able to caught up, who may not have been able to work through the training at the same time as other people. And the consequences of that are, of course, that they're then compromised in terms of meeting the payments on their car, on their house, and we can see where that leads in terms of increasing the amount of social inequity and social division in our society. So work has a great deal of responsibility. The way that work is framed has a great deal of responsibility for the way that we live in our society and the kinds of opportunities that we may have. And we need to think about it in some depth. So I hope this has been useful for you to begin to think about that kind of process. It really is worth looking at some of the historical perspectives, and I'll provide a list of some of those books for you to have a explore of later on. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.